welcome everybody. My name is Tony Powers. I'm the branch manager here at the Austin Irving branch of the Chicago Public Library. And we're very happy to be able to have Mr. Richard Lindberg speak to us tonight about the Black Sox. It's the 100th anniversary of the Chicago White Sox Black Sox scandal. And it's an important part of Chicago history, baseball history. Mr. Lindberg is an authority on the White Sox, as well as other Chicago history topics. I've put a sampling of some of his books over here to my left. If you have a library card, please feel free to check them out. There's other books about the White Sox, including the classic 8 Men Out, which Mr. Lindberg was a consultant to the movie and also appeared in the movie. So having said all that, welcome, and I'm going to turn this over to Mr. Lindberg.
Thanks, Tony. Good evening and welcome, and thank you for coming out. I mean, tonight is the night the White Sox are playing the Kansas City Royals. I mean, I know we're all in suspense on the outcome of that game, but thank you for that very gracious introduction. For many years, I've been a White Sox historian. I have done a lot of work for the White Sox in a history capacity going back to the late 1970s when, just before Bill Veeck acquired the team. And I've had a relationship with them, which has kind of been a dream come true for a kid who grew up in the Northwest Side, being a White Sox fan in Clubland. Are we all White Sox fans here tonight? Yeah. Okay. Well, we're going to talk about an ignominious chapter in White Sox history, one that I believe has a profound and lasting impact on the team of our modern era. It's one of those things, one of those occurrences that are game-changing, quite literally, because if you looked at the Chicago White Sox franchise up to 1919 and 1920, you had a powerful, dominant ball club that in many ways eclipsed the Cubs in fan interest, in media coverage. Today, when the Chicago Tribune does not even send a reporter to cover the team on the road, sometimes not even at home. Back in those days, the Chicago White Sox, through the force of personality and the popularity of their owner, Charles Albert Comiskey, commanded the loyalty of the media. The White Sox got all the coverage. Even though the Cubs were winning pennants in World Series and had a tremendous run in the early part of the 20th century, the sentiment in Chicago was with the White Sox. But all of that tragically changed with the events of 1919 and 1920 that we know today as the Black Sox scandal. As Tony mentioned, I had a little bit of a role to play in John Sayles' direction of 8 Men Out, the movie that came out in 1988, which on a very limited budget to work with, he invented 2 ballparks in one ballpark, which was in Indianapolis, and he turned that into Redland Field in Comiskey Park. And you can kind of see that it's one ballpark. They change some of the signs in the advertising, but they use that one ballpark on a very cold and blustery day or week of shooting in October of 1987, and the movie came out a year later. I provided historical interpretation. I worked with the set designers. I worked with Sayles' research team in providing them with information. And I also had a chance to meet and talk about the scandal with Elliot Azanoff, the author of the book 8 Men Out. Now, since 1988, I have pretty much done a 100% turnaround in my beliefs and opinions about this momentous event in White Sox history, and in particular, the 8 Men Out, the 8 players who conspired to throw the 1919 World Series. In my younger years, I was a sympathetic supporter of exonerating Shoeless Joe Jackson, Buck Weaver, and believing that they were victims of cruel fate and injustice by a greedy owner. But then, as the years passed and I began researching this a lot further, and I began really digging into the bones of Elliot Azanoff's book, I found a lot of half-truths, outright lies, and misinterpretations of historical events. one of the key things to remember about this is what a beloved figure Charles Comiskey was up until the publication of Eight Men Out in 1963. Since that time, he has been recast somewhat harshly as a misanthrope, a venal, greedy capitalist that exploited these underpaid players. Well, I believe quite strongly that Comiskey was a man of his times. He was not unlike any other of the owners in those days. If you would, foul balls would be hit into the stands, ushers would grab the ball and put it back in the playing field. Comiskey wasn't the only one. It was said that Comiskey made the players pay for laundering of their uniforms. Well, so did the other owners. Not to say this was a good thing for them to do, but it was consistent with the practices of the time. But more alarming to me were the outright distortions and historical lies that were told about these players related to Elliot Azanoff. And I do believe that Azanoff intended well, and he interviewed Ed Saicotti just before he died. Saicotti died in 1969, and a few of the surviving players told their side of the scandal and gave their own particular spin to Azanoff, but Azanoff did not bother talking to other people, notably the Comiskey family. Chuck Comiskey could have provided him with a world of good information, but the historical inaccuracies really bother me. And before I start the presentation, I'm going to point out a few of them. It was said in the book that the great pitcher, the great knuckleball pitcher, Ed Saicotti, was withheld from winning his 30th game in 1919 because Comiskey did not want to pay a promised $10,000 bonus if he won 30 games. In those days, baseball was a lot different. Pitchers pitched complete games, and they made many more starts than what they do. For example, Ed Walsh won 40 games in 1908. If you go day by day in September of 1919, you will find that Saicotti was not held back. He was in the rotation. His last start, when he had a chance to win his 30th game, was against the St. Louis Browns on September 26, 1919. That was the day the White Sox clinched the American League pennant. They beat the Browns 5-4. Saicotti was ineffective, taken out in the 7th inning, and the White Sox won the game in the 9th. That would have been his 30th victory. Also, Saicotti left the team on September 10th for 4 days to go up to his home in Detroit, Michigan, to purchase a farm. And I strongly suspect that it was with the part of the $10,000 that he was promised by the gamblers that he used as a down payment to buy that farm. And Lefty Williams, John Sayles made a great issue in the movie of showing how Mrs. Williams was threatened with her life if Lefty didn't come through and lose that game, as he was said to when he was told what to do, and he ended up losing it because he supposedly feared that his wife was going to be killed by gangsters. That never happened. Azanoff, in fact, invented the character of the gangster to threaten Lefty Williams as dramatic appeal in the book Eight Men Out. Moreover, Eight Men Out is really not a baseball book per se. It's more of a political discussion of labor versus capital. Azanoff used the Black Sox scandal as a platform to evoke his sympathies for the labor movement. The early chapters of the book, for example, are borrowed straight out of a biography that was published of Charles Comiskey in 1919. It's a book called Commie by a Chicago sports writer named Gus Axelson. And he literally lifted the first 2 or 3 chapters about Comiskey's life and just rewrote it so it wouldn't be complete plagiarism. And thereafter, he kind of ran with the story. It is a very interesting book in the sense that it reads well. It's a good detective novel, but like many good detective novels, in many ways it's fiction. So I've stated that, and I'm going to go forward now and give you the presentation on the Black Sox scandal. I have a number of slides here, and I apologize for the old technology. We were talking about that earlier. I am converting my presentations to PowerPoint, but I still have so many of these slides in this 1969 vintage Kodak. I still rely on it, and so I think it'll do the job, and if you bear with me, we'll go through it. And if you have any questions at the end or want to discuss some of the points that I'm talking about, I will be more than happy to answer your questions, and we can share some thoughts on this. I think the lights are pretty good. Tony, I don't think we need to. The story of the White Sox rightfully begins with Charles Albert Comiskey, a son of Chicago, born in 1859 on the west side. His father, John Comiskey, had that very interesting nickname that you don't usually associate with politicians, Honest John Comiskey. He was alderman of the 7th Ward on the west side. Prominent figure in Chicago history, organized a Civil War brigade in 1861, and he never imagined that his son Charles would become a baseball player, but a baseball player he did, and a Hall of Famer eventually. Charles Comiskey started his baseball career in Dubuque, Iowa in 1879. There's a baseball field out there to this day called Comiskey Field. He became a very adept and skilled first baseman, and was the first baseman to actually play off the bag. I mean, today we take that for granted, but in 19th century baseball, very often the fielder would keep his foot firmly planted on the bag, and the ball would zoom right into right field, and he would make no attempt to field or catch the ball. Comiskey, it is said, was the first baseman to play off the bag and field his position. He was a star player and manager of the St. Louis Browns of the American Association, and after his playing days ended, he managed the Cincinnati Reds from 1892 to 1894, and it was there that he met Ban Johnson, the founder of the American League, who, with Comiskey, turned the American League into the second major league. Can everybody see that, or do we need to lower the lights a little further? We'll lower it a little bit further here. The White Sox played in a wooden grandstand that had seated comfortably no more than 5,000 people. It was called the Southside Grounds. It had a little upper deck enclosure, but it was here that Comiskey moved his White Sox to begin the 1900 season. He had acquired a team in Sioux City, Iowa called the Cornhuskers at the urging of Ban Johnson, and he moved that team to St. Paul with money borrowed from his father, the alderman. And he had a successful operation in St. Paul. They were the original St. Paul Saints. In 1900, when Ban Johnson had the notion of turning the Western League into the second American professional baseball league, he urged Comiskey to move his team to Chicago. The St. Paul Saints became the Chicago White Stockings in 1900. The 1900 season is not an officially recognized season. Most people say it all began in 1901. Well, actually, the White Sox won the pennant in 1900, but it was considered a minor league. The only time in Sox history the Sox won back-to-back pennants was 1900 and 1901, but 1900 doesn't count, and that's kind of typical of the misfortunes of the White Sox. But in this little ballpark, the White Sox became an instant overnight favorite. Southside Bridgeport community in Canaryville, heavily Irish. Comiskey, whose lineage traced back to the old sod, cultivated powerful friendships with the neighborhood people, with the aldermen, with the show people, and he established the White Sox as the dominant franchise. He did this by catering to the media, and within a few years he was a much beloved figure. In fact, they wanted him to run for alderman of the 5th Ward in 1908, but he turned that down. This is the baseball palace of the world, which he financed privately. Comiskey Park opened on July 1st, 1910. It was a mammoth-sized stadium compared to the little wooden structures that had gone before. And as you can see, lines of patrons showed up. They had never. It was likened to the Roman Colosseum. And it's one reason why Comiskey got the nickname, the Old Roman. Some say it was because of his long nose. Others say it was out of token of respect to the idea that he had built a Roman Colosseum in Chicago. At the conclusion of the 1913 season, he took the White Sox around the world with the New York Giants. They played a game in the sands in front of the Sphinx in the winter of 1914. While they were sailing from Seattle to the Philippines, the boat nearly sunk. Can you imagine that? Comiskey was playing cards underneath the deck and drinking and smoking his cigars, and everybody was hanging over the edge, seasick, in these choppy waters. And several times, the players later reported they thought they were going to capsize in the heavy seas. But the trip was a worldwide success. It ended in England, playing before King George in Wembley Stadium in March of 1914, and it brought Comiskey to the much greater heights than he had ever imagined. This is Byron Bancroft Johnson, sports editor at the Cincinnati Commercial Gazette. And he befriended Comiskey when Comiskey managed the Reds. And the two of them hatched their plan to create the American League at a little downtown Cincinnati bar called the Tip Top Club. And Cincinnati Reds owner John T. Brush placed Johnson in charge of that Western League, which in turn became the American League in 1900. It was designed to be a clean alternative to the National League, which was corrupted by owners owning 2 or 3 teams at a time, the rowdiness of baseball, the free-flowing booze. It wasn't the kind of experience that you would take families to. And it was Johnson envisioned a league that would be a little more cleaner and run a little bit more efficiently. And together, they formed the American League and made some very shrewd moves. On January 28, 1901, after that successful 1900 season, the newly born American League declared its independence from the National League, and they added teams in Baltimore, Boston, Philadelphia, and Washington to create the modern American League. And they went to war with the Nationals. And that was a war that was eventually won by the American League, and the first World Series was played in 1903. Shoeless Joe Jackson, he's the subject of many, many arguments. Should he be exonerated? Should he not? He was born in Pickens County, South Carolina. He debuted with the Philadelphia Athletics on August 25th, 1908. Played with Cleveland from 1910 to 1915, and he was acquired by the White Sox on August 20th, 1915 for the sum of $31,000 and 3 bench players, Robert Roth, Larry Chappell, and Ed Klepfer. Probably one of the greatest trades that the White Sox ever made. It's just a shame what happened with the outcome of it. He was a natural hitter, Jackson was. He hit 411 in 1908, one of a handful of players to hit 400. He arrived in Chicago with an ironclad 4-year contract, and he was paid in 1919 the sum of $6,299. That was a salary not quite equal to what his teammate Eddie Collins, a Princeton-educated player, was making, but nevertheless it was in the upper tier of salary structures within the American League. One of the things that Azanoff does not mention in 8 Men Out is that the White Sox had the largest payroll in 1919 of any American League team. Payroll is often commensurate to how well a team plays. Look at the Yankees, look at the Dodgers, and look at the Cubs, and you see what money will buy for you. Jackson swung a bat called Black Betsy. The whole notion of him playing shoeless, well, there's several versions of that story. It was said that as a kid, he played in gravel lots in Greenville, South Carolina. Others say that when he was playing in the low minor leagues, he would play the outfield without his shoes on. It's never been firmly established one way or the other. And it was said he couldn't write. Well, I've examined one of the contracts that he signed, and although the handwriting is extremely shaky, nevertheless, you can see that it was Joe Jackson. And I don't believe his wife signed it. It looks like a male, masculine handwriting. Joe Jackson, he hit 351 in 1919, and he had a great World Series batting average-wise, but his hits did not come at crucial moments of the games. And more significantly, in the 1920 season, there is strong evidence that the White Sox were throwing games in the last month of the season in order to allow the gamblers to put their money on the Cleveland Indians. Talk a little bit more about that. The ringleaders of the scandal were Arnold Chick Gandil and Charles Swede Risberg. Risberg is forever immortalized in the poem "The Swede is a Hard Guy" by Nelson Algren. How many of you have read that poem? Are you familiar with it? He was a young player. He was only a 3-year player. It's not coincidental that the two ringleaders of the scandal, Gandil and Risberg, had the greatest amount of antipathy towards Comiskey. They were two of the lower paid players. But again, Risberg was only a 3-year player in 1920. He came up in the 1917 season. Gandil had been around quite a bit. He was a 10-year player. He had a lot of scraps with the law and actually had been arrested a couple times in his early career. Born in St. Paul, Minnesota, to Swiss immigrants. And he said in his own admission, and I quote, "I was a wild, rough kid. I did a little heavyweight fighting for $150 a fight. I also worked part-time as a boilermaker in the copper mines." And he became a first baseman playing in the Mexican League in 1908. The White Sox picked him up through the customary way in those days. Was they were bought at auction from minor league teams. This was long before you had teams aligned, minor league teams aligned with professional teams. You would, in the offseason, you would acquire players from, say, the Pacific Coast League simply by paying a given amount of money to acquire the services of that player. And Comiskey was very adept at identifying talent. This is how he acquired Lefty Williams, and this is how he acquired Gandil and Risberg, because he had scouts operating in the minor leagues. Of the 8 players, perhaps the least culpable of them is George Buck Weaver, the third from the left, or the first from the left here. Buck Weaver played the game the way it should be played. He was an aggressive, outstanding player, average hitter, but a brilliant glove man. He played shortstop and was switched over to third base when Risberg came up in 1917. And he played his heart out. His crime was the fact that he had guilty knowledge of his teammates throwing the 1919 World Series, and he kept it to himself. He didn't rat them out, as they say. But he never collected any money from the Black Sox scandal, and he did not really participate in any of the organizational meetings with the gamblers. And many years later, when Chuck Comiskey was alive and I had interviewed him, I asked him quite straight out, I said, would your grandfather, the old Roman, ever consider exonerating and reinstating Buck Weaver to active duty? And he said that in the 1920s, the old man Comiskey would have done it. He would have, if it was in his power to do so, he would have reinstated Buck Weaver after he knew the full story. However, he could not because organized baseball had completely banned Weaver. For many years thereafter, Weaver had petitioned organized baseball for reinstatement, and there were many similar appeals. In fact, in 2005, then U.S. Senator Barack Obama and Dick Durbin sent a letter to Bud Selig, Commissioner of Baseball, seeking a pardon. It was what?
Just Obama.
Just Obama?
I wrote the book.
Mike, this is Mike Donahue. He worked in Barack Obama's office in Washington, and on his authority, I will say you're right. It was just Obama that did it. Okay. Buck Weaver died a broken man. He lived on the South Side. He died in 1956, and he was working as a tout at the racetracks. He played a little bit of outlaw baseball after 1919, but never was reinstated. He is the only one who I believe deserves dispensation for 1919. This is Claude Lefty Williams, the only other pitcher in Major League Baseball to lose 3 games in a World Series was George Frazier of the New York Yankees in 1981, I want to say. But he shares the dubious record with Lefty of losing 3 games in the World Series. Lefty Williams was a Pacific Coast League player who Comiskey brought in. He was originally signed by the Detroit Tigers and played in the Southern League, and he played 6 games for the Tigers before he went back into the minors, and the White Sox picked him up. He won 13 games in 1916, 17 in 1917, and was a 20-game winner in both 1919 and 1920. But in both series, 17 and 19, that the White Sox were in the World Series, he did very poorly in the World Series. This is a shot of Claude Lefty Williams, pitching in Redland Field in Cincinnati. Redland Field eventually became Crosley Field. It was the home of the Cincinnati Reds until they left after the 1969 season to move into Riverfront Stadium. And the notion that Williams' wife, as I had mentioned earlier, was physically threatened with her life is a piece of fiction that was invented by Elliot Azanoff. Williams was portrayed by actor James Reed in the 1988 film 8 Men Out. The Clean Sox, as they were called, Ray Schalk and Eddie Collins. You can safely say that there were 2 cliques on that team. There were the northern players who were better educated. Eddie Collins was a Princeton man. And then you had the southern players like Joe Jackson. Many of them had started out in very hard scrabble employment, working in the mines, kicking about, growing up in impoverished households. And there was a regional prejudice, if you will, between the city-born northern players and the rural southerners. And it kind of split into a clique that existed in one form or another from 1917 all the way through the end of the 1920 season. Ray Schalk was a local guy. He was born in Harvey. He had great mental toughness. He was small in size, but he was like a grizzly bear in many ways. He caught more than 100 games in 12 straight seasons. And in the World Series, he hit .304. It was during the series that he nearly got into a fist fight with Lefty Williams after he decided that Williams was not playing up to his capability. And Schalk played 16 years for the White Sox. He was a manager of the team in 1927. And in a crazy stunt in 1927, he caught a ball thrown from the top of the Chicago Tribune Tower. Dangerous feat when a projectile comes down that fast. It was a very publicized event. Thousands of people stood on Michigan Avenue watching Schalk trying to catch that ball. He was elected to the Hall of Fame in 1964, and he operated a bowling alley for many years thereafter. Eddie Collins, part of the so-called Philadelphia A's $1 million infield. Comiskey paid Connie Mack, the owner of the A's, $50,000 to acquire Collins, and paid him, which was then a record high for the White Sox, $15,000 a year. Now, much of this money was guaranteed, and this was part of the reason that the Black Sox players were so envious and jealous. They thought Eddie Collins was putting on airs. They thought he was arrogant, and he made all this much more money than they did. And another point of contention, in the 1920 season, as the final days were closing out on that year, then realized it took a whole year from 1919 to the end of the 1920 season for this scandal to become public knowledge. Collins went to Charles Comiskey in the closing days of the 1920 season to complain about the White Sox, his teammates. He said that they weren't giving it their best effort. The Sox went on a crucial road trip in early September of 1920, and they lost games in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia that they should have won. And they had squandered a fairly nice lead in the midsummer, and the Cleveland Indians, of course, eventually overtook them. But Collins alerted Comiskey and said, the Black Sox, he didn't use that term, the White Sox, my teammates, are letting us down. Comiskey chose not to hear. He knew the story, but he didn't acknowledge it publicly from Eddie Collins. Collins also managed the White Sox in 1926, and he later acquired part interest in ownership of the Boston Red Sox. Manager Kid Gleason and Dickie Kerr, the hero of the World Series. Little Dickie Kerr, Ring Lardner, the famous Chicago Tribune columnist, called him Wee Dickie Kerr, the world's shortest southpaw, and immortalized him in his columns and then later in his book. Ring Lardner had a column called You Know Me, Al, and he made Dickie Kerr one of the ongoing characters in that. Kerr won 2 games in the World Series, and his wins created a rift between the gamblers and the players. Dickie Kerr wasn't expected to perform as well as he did, but he will be forever remembered. And I guess if there is any injustice, poor Dickie Kerr himself found himself later banned by organized baseball, because in a salary dispute with Comiskey a few years later, he jumped the team and he played outlaw ball. That is, he played for a team that was not sanctioned by professional baseball, and for that unpardonable sin, he was banned. However, the ban was lifted by Judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis, and he made a brief appearance in 1925, but didn't fare too well. Kid Gleason, they called him Pops. He had been with the White Sox since 1917. He was a pretty tough guy, but he was very fatherly, and he was really the genius behind Clarence Rowland, who was the youthful 36-year-old manager who led the 1917 White Sox to a World Series win. But when Rowland fell through and the team finished under 500 a year later, he promoted the kid to become manager of the White Sox. Gleason was a former second baseman of the 1890s, a rough and tumble kind of player, but he always believed in his men and stood by them all the way through until the Black Sox outcome and the trial and the banning of the players. He was emotionally shattered by the experience, and after he was done with them in 1923, his career in baseball was essentially over. Ed Saicotti, a figure of enduring controversy, he threw a wicked knuckleball, which he called the old shine ball. You might remember that from, how many of you have seen 8 Men Out? Yeah. Saicotti admitted he was one of the 2 players that confessed to the grand jury. He and Joe Jackson confessed to the fact that they had met with the gamblers in the Buckminster Hotel in Boston a week before the season was closed, and it was there and then that the deal was made to throw the World Series. Saicotti said he needed the money, and it was only because of that fact and that he was looking to buy that farm that he agreed to conspire to throw the World Series. He later said it was the greatest mistake of his life, and before he passed away in 1969, he said that it was something that he carried with him all through his days, and he's tried to lead a clean and sober life, and he said, I have nothing to be ashamed of in my life except for that one regrettable incident. But that one regrettable incident really cost him his reputation, likely a trip to the Hall of Fame, and the everlasting embarrassment that went with it. The 1919 White Sox battled out of the gate and posted a 24-9 record on June 1st and had a commanding, at that point, early commanding lead of 3 games. They bobbed and weaved from first to third place through the next month or so until they swept a doubleheader with the Philadelphia A's on July 9th, and thereafter they never relinquished first place, building a lead as high as 8 games on September the 9th. The meeting I spoke of in Boston took place on September 19th and 20th, a couple days before the pennant was clinched in St. Louis. And it was there that the gambler Joseph Sports Sullivan met privately with the unhappy players. Gambling in baseball up until this point had been endemic to the game. There were rumors and allegations of players throwing games in the 1880s and the 1890s. And it's tragic because baseball was considered the only pure, honest sport in the United States. Boxing was clouded by its reputation with gamblers and fights being thrown. Horse racing, of course, was never considered entirely clean. Pro football had not yet emerged as a professional sport. The NFL wasn't founded until the early 1920s. And baseball was the king sport, the king of all the sports. And despite all the rumors and allegations of crooked wrongdoing in baseball, it seemed to uphold its reputation as a clean sport. But in 1917, it was alleged during the subsequent grand jury hearing that the White Sox themselves paid a bribe to the Detroit Tigers to lose a doubleheader in the second week of the 1917 season that would help the White Sox salt away the 1917 pennant. They collected a kitty from all the players and gave it to the Tigers to lay down for a doubleheader. This is an obscured story, but there seems to be a lot of veracity to it. It was brought up as an example that this was not an isolated event, that there was gambling was going on. Well, who are the bad guys? I'm going to introduce you to a couple of them. This was one of the main fixers, Abe Attell. Abraham Washington Attell, 1883 to 1970. He was a featherweight boxer and the world champion from 1906 to 1912. He was also said to be a good pal of gangster and gambler in New York City, Arnold Rothstein. Attell was one of the middlemen in the fix. Now, historians still debate the role of Arnold Rothstein. He was called the Big Bankroll, the Wizard of Odds. He was a bootlegger, but mostly a powerful gambler based in New York City. It was said that Attell and a former White Sox pitcher by the name of Sleepy Bill Burns, and they called him Sleepy because as a player he used to fall asleep on the bench. That's how people get nicknames in baseball. That there was talk that Burns had heard that these White Sox players were unhappy with their situation. And there was a lot of social interaction in those days, mostly in hotel saloons where players and gamblers would co-mingle with one another. Baseball stadiums did not have the same kind of security that they do today. Players in some of the old ballparks wouldn't even have locker rooms in the stadium. They'd be brought in either by a truck or a horse wagon, and they'd come walking in through center field. And there were opportunities for underworld figures to make contact. And somewhere along the line, Attell and Burns got together and decided that they could pull this off. Attell, curiously enough, is considered today to be a tremendous boxer of great repute, and he is actually, he's been actually inducted to several boxing Hall of Fames. He died on February 7th, 1970. He conveniently escaped to Canada during the subsequent grand jury hearings. But more than anyone, I believe he was the key player to make this whole thing happen. Boston gambler Joseph J. Sports Sullivan. I thought he was brilliantly played in the Eight Men Out, by the way. He was a knockabout gambler, very prominent in the Boston underworld of the 1920s. Bookmaker, thug. He had actually tried to bribe the great Cy Young in 1903 to lose ball games. He ran a bucket shop operation selling fraudulent financial speculation in Boston in the 1900s to unwary investors, but later became known as the King of the Gamblers. And he kind of pulled it all together. It was in September of 1919 that he made contact with Chick Gandil at the Buckminster. Gandil and Risberg were the two key players, as I mentioned. And in the hotel room, it's where they conspired to fix the World Series. It's disputed as to who made contact with the other. However, Gandil had known Sullivan since 1912, and he later said that it was Sullivan who approached him and not the other way around. Sullivan suggested to Gandil that he try to recruit some of his other unhappy teammates, and they pulled it together. Initially, Arnold Rothstein in New York thought about this, and he rejected the idea. David Petrugia, the author of a book about Rothstein, later had a change of heart. He didn't believe it would be possible to fix a World Series. And by the way, those of you who have read The Great Gatsby or seen the movie, the character of Meyer Wolfsheim, the gambler who has the cufflinks that are made out of human molars, that is based on Arnold Rothstein, the man who fixed the World Series. But Rothstein, it is believed, agreed to bankroll the fix for $80,000. And he put up $40,000 in seed money to Sports Sullivan to distribute it to the involved players. However, Sullivan kept $30,000 of it for his own wagering and gave only the $10,000 to Gandil. Sullivan did not testify in front of the grand jury in October 1920 because he had a very powerful attorney who had represented a number of underworld characters. William the Mouthpiece Fallon, who was famously known in New York City, persuaded Sullivan not to testify. Sullivan later fled, and in later years, he turned up in Yankee Stadium during the 1926 World Series, was recognized by Van Johnson, who promptly had the police escort him out of the stadium. He died in Massachusetts in 1949 and never served a day in prison. This is Charles Comiskey at the peak of his powers in baseball as one of the most influential owners in the game, the co-founder of the American League. A very healthy, robust Charles Comiskey, photo taken about 1917 or so. And then you contrast this photo with another one I'm going to show you later on of Comiskey less than 5 years later, where he had become a withered, drawn old man before his time. This scandal had an enormous, enormous impact upon Comiskey, who later became a recluse up at his cabin up in Eagle River, Wisconsin. This is Arnold Rothstein, the big bankroll, born 1882 and 1883, thereabouts, nobody's quite sure. He died on November 6, 1928, with his shoes on. He was shot by a gambler in a New York City hotel. Apparently Rothstein, who was known to Welsh on bets, had cut this guy out of the money, and the vengeful gambler shot him in a private poker game, but was never, nobody ever had served any time. He was called the Wizard of Oz because he had brilliant mathematical abilities. At the age of 28 years old, he settled in the Tenderloin section of Manhattan, which was one of the worst vice districts in the Lower East Side, where he established a casino. He invested heavily in horse racing tracks all across the country, and it was reputed that he had fixed a number of races. He had a network of informants with very deep pockets from all across the United States to keep him alert to what was going on, including Abatel and Sport Sullivan. Ironically enough, this is the kicker to the whole thing. Rothstein was summoned to Chicago in the fall of 1920 to testify to the grand jury as they were considering their indictments, to talk about if it was true that he had fixed the World Series. He was very persuasive on the stand and said no. In fact, he would never be stupid enough to bet on a single game. And yeah, you know, he did put some side money down, but it was on the White Sox. And like a lot of people, he lost because the White Sox were the favored team. And he said he would never cast his lot with Abatel, who we considered a cheap gangster. And the grand jury cleared him. And attorney Alfred Austrian, one of the founders of Mayor Brown, who represented Comiskey in his interests during the entire proceeding, called Rothstein guiltless and said he made a fine presentation, and there was nobody who could have convinced him that Rothstein had anything to do with this despicable scandal. Well, I think history dictates otherwise. If you were going to the World Series in 1919, you could get an upper deck box seat for $5.50. Game 1 in Cincinnati, there's the rain check for Game 1, and the ticket on the bottom is for Comiskey Park. I guess you'd have to do the math and figure out what a $5.50 ticket would be with inflation, but it does seem rather ridiculously cheap, does it not? This is batting practice in Redland Field before Game 1. It was a simple coin toss that got the Cincinnati Reds home field advantage. This World Series was the first of 3 World Series that were a best of 9. World War I had ended in 1918. We were trying to return to normalcy, which was a quote of President Warren G. Harding. And by the way, Governor Warren Harding attended Game 1 of the World Series along with the President of Cuba during the 1919 World Series. But the return to normalcy meant, let's expand the World Series to a best of 9, give people a chance to go to more games, but also let's make a little more money on it. So in 1919, 20, and 21, you had the best of 9 games. And it commenced in Redland Field on a sweltering day. It was about 88 degrees, much like it is today, when the first pitch was thrown. Ed Cicotti, and there's always a debate on how you pronounce his name. Some people say Cicott, but I found a newspaper clip from that era, and it was C-Y, capital C-O-T-T, so it's Cicotti is the correct pronunciation of his last name. The tip-off that this fix was on to the gamblers who had congregated in the hotel in Cincinnati and into the ballpark was the Cicotti's agreement to hit the very first batter, Maury Rath, which he did. And it's kind of interesting that after he struck Maury Rath and put him on first base, Cicotti gets off the mound and he walks over to Rath and he pats him on the back. He says, "Are you okay? I didn't hurt you, did I?" And the game resumed. The rumors had run rife for the week leading up to the World Series that the series was fixed. The money that had been bet heavily on the White Sox a team that was by far the class of professional baseball. The Reds were kind of, I guess you might think of them today as a wild card that luckily won a pennant, but they were in no way near as talented position by position as the White Sox were. So the odds dramatically shifted, and the money was heavily bet on Cincinnati. Well, Psychotti fell apart as was predicted. The Reds won the first game 9-1 before a crowd of 30,000. On the second day, the Reds won again 4-2. But on October 3rd, the third game, the White Sox rebounded in Comiskey Park with a 2-0 victory. The series lasted through 8 games. The Reds won the World Series on October 9th with a score of 10-5 in Comiskey Park. This was the game where Shoeless Joe Jackson hit a home run. Joe hit .375 for the World Series, but the home run came when the game was well out of hand and nobody was on base. So the question is, how do players actually fix a game? Well, you know, a line drive's coming at a left fielder, you kind of run toward that ball just a little bit slower than you might normally, and the ball falls in front of you. You overthrow the cutoff man. And these were sins that the White Sox players were guilty of. And it alerted the press that something was up. Hugh Fullerton of the Chicago Tribune, a sports writer, correctly predicted with Ring Lardner that this series was on the take. And there's a famous scene in the movie that actually happened where Ring Lardner is walking down the train when the players are going back to Chicago for Game 3, and he's humming the song "I'm Forever Blowing Ball Games," based on "I'm Forever Blowing Bubbles," that the gamblers treat me fair. And he was walking down the coach of the car while the players were sitting there, and none of the players said anything as he did that. John Sayles, the director of the movie, played Ring Lardner in that memorable scene and looks like Ring Lardner. The resemblance was uncanny. But all throughout the series, the rumors were afoot, but nothing was said. It was the kind of thing where you don't want it to be true, but you don't want to acknowledge it either. It was said that in the hotel in Cincinnati, that Ray Schalk went and knocked on the door of Comiskey, wanting to talk to him about this, and he had talked to Kid Gleason, and Kid Gleason refused to believe that such a thing could be happening. And in the movie, you see Van Johnson leaving Comiskey's room angrily, and then John Hadler of the National League was there, and Elliot Azanoff played John Hadler in the movie. So Azanoff was on set for that. This is Cincinnati Reds manager Pat Moran and Kid Gleason going over the ground rules just before the start of Game 1. They used to have a little quip. They said, "You can Pat Moran, but you can't Kid Gleason." So everybody was full of rhymes in those days. This is game action at Redland Field. See, it kind of looks a little like Camden Yards in Baltimore, you know, with the warehouse factories in the back. Very quaint field, and later on, of course, became Crosley Field. Well, after the World Series had concluded, the Reds hoisted their championship flag. There was a book in the 1960s that came out that disputed the whole idea that the White Sox threw the World Series and that the Reds actually won legitimately. I don't believe that to be the case at all. This was clearly a fix from the very first moment. Now, as the 1920 season unfolded, the rumors kept circulating, and there was a drumbeat all year long that this series was crooked. And it actually, the exposure really happened as a result of Chicago Cubs, not the White Sox. There was a pitcher named Claude Hendricks of the Cubs who had pitched for the Federal League team, the Chicago Whales, and the grand jury was summoned to investigate his probe into fixing a game against the Philadelphia Phillies on August 31st of 1920 that a Cub pitcher, and I guess this is typical Sox fans, would initiate this misery. Well, Hendricks went and said, well, you can point the finger at me, but look at those guys on the south side. That's who you really should be looking at. There was another player by the name of William Joseph Maharg, and that is Graham spelled backwards, I might mention. And he was a shady kind of player who had bet heavily on this World Series. And Maharg spelled backwards is Graham. There was a player called Peaches Graham, and a lot of conspiracy theorists have said that Peaches Graham was really Billy Maharg. Society of American Baseball Research people have investigated the death records and found out that there was a Peaches Graham and there was a Billy Maharg, and Maharg truly was his last name. But Maharg, who was a former player and fought fights in Philadelphia, Sandlot player, he was the one who went to the press with these allegations. Jimmy Isamanger of the Philadelphia newspaper, he said the World Series was fixed, and on September 29th, 1920, Isamanger's story went national, and that is when the Black Sox scandal broke. The grand jury was summoned, and the whole thing unraveled. This is the Black Sox players, and they were called the Black Sox because, several reasons. Many of them said their uniforms were so dirty that they were called black. Or they were crooked. They were black-hearted souls, so they were the Black Sox. Well, yeah, they had to launder their old uniforms, but so did everybody else in those days. But here they are, confident of an acquittal. They were indicted on a nebulous charge of conspiring to defraud a player by the name of Charles K. Nims out of a couple $100. There was no statute in the Cook County ledgers that addressed fixing a World Series. So they had to kind of hang it on one person, one individual, and Nims, who had bet heavily on the White Sox, lost, and the indictment was based on that. Well, Rothstein came in to testify. Maharg came into Chicago to repeat his testimony to the grand jury. Comiskey actually offered Maharg $10,000 to get up on the stand and to testify to what he knew, but Maharg said, I don't want Comiskey's money, I will do this because I just want to expose this whole thing, which he did, and he gave full details. This is the White Sox dream team of their lawyer to the right. There you see Buck Weaver in the middle. He's smiling. He's very confident of an acquittal. That's attorney Ahern to the right, who later defended Al Capone in the 1920s. That's Risberg to the far right. And the guy in second from the left, I don't really know who that individual is, but this was taken in the grand jury rooms. As that grand jury was summoned, the White Sox were down to almost the last day of the season in a neck-and-neck fight for the American League pennant against the Cleveland Indians. And before that last series against St. Louis was to be played, Comiskey suspended all 8 of the players, and it cost the White Sox the American League pennant. They lost 2 out of 3 games to St. Louis to close out the 1920 season. Cleveland won a tainted pennant and went to the World Series. The grand jury was summoned in July of 1921, and they reached their decision on October 22nd of 1920, and the players were acquitted of a conspiracy to defraud baseball and of Charles K. Nims. However, this wasn't the end of it. Kennesaw Mountain Landis, a federal judge in Chicago who decided the landmark 1907 antitrust case against Standard Oil, became the appointed baseball's first appointed commissioner. And he ruled for an iron hand from 1920 to 1944, and he immediately ordered the permanent banishment of the 8 players of the Chicago White Sox, plus a second baseman from St. Louis named Joe Gideon, who had testified that he had bet on the Cincinnati Reds during the World Series. Hal Chase, a notorious gambler who was the first baseman for the New York Giants, very star player but crooked. He too was banned, along with many lesser and greater lights over the next year. Baseball was desperate to preserve its reputation, and they relinquished all their governing power to Judge Landis, who was a very capricious individual. His tenure on the bench in Chicago was pockmarked with many cases that were later overturned, and he was heavily criticized for some of his decisions. But I guess one, in all fairness, can say that he helped permanently restore the reputation of professional baseball at its blackest moment. I told you earlier about how Comiskey had aged. Look at this photo of him. This was taken in 1921, and that's Bill Veck's father, William Veck Sr., who was a sports writer and later was part owner of the Chicago Cubs. You can see how the old Roman, in just a few years, went from being a robust, healthy, middle-aged man to a very old man. Through the 1920s, with these players gone, the White Sox fell into a 30-year swoon, which I call the wandering in the desert years. From 1921 until 1951, spanning 30 years, they only had a handful of winning seasons. They had a plus side record in 1926, 27, 36, 37, 39, and 43, and that was it. The rest of the time, they wallowed in 7th or 8th place. Comiskey spent big bucks going the customary route of recruiting top-flight minor league players, none of whom panned out. The old Roman died in October 1931 and left the team to his son John Lewis and the general manager, Harry Grabner, whose daughter was June Travis, a actress in the 1930s and the 1940s. J. Lou suffered from rheumatic fever, and he died in 1939. By now, the White Sox had undergone nearly 2 decades of losing baseball. They relinquished their market domination to the Cubs, who began winning pennants on 3-year cycles, 1929, 1932, 35, and 38. You could say every 3 years the Cubs were going to the World Series. Let's hope that doesn't happen this year. This is the 3rd year. Well, J. Lou died. He was a very sickly man. He had rheumatic fever as a kid. He turned over the team to his widow, Grace Reedy Comiskey, on the left. Grace's daughter, the second from the left, Dorothy Comiskey Rigney. She later married John Rigney, a White Sox pitcher. That's young Chuck. At the age of 22, he was elevated to a full vice presidency of the White Sox in 1949, and he set about, he's one of the unsung heroes of Chicago White Sox history. He changed the team overnight. He got rid of that clunky-looking SOX logo, invented the pinstripes and the Old English logo, which we see today. And he told me, he said, if I couldn't make these guys win, at least I would make them look like winners by giving them pinstripes. It took a couple of years, but in 1951, the wandering in the desert years ended. The White Sox broke out of their slump, and they went on to 17 consecutive First Division finishes, ending in 1967, which was inclusive of their World Series appearance of 1959.
Third longest in history.
Huh?
Third longest.
Right. The Yankees and the Orioles are the only 2 teams before divisional play that had that many consecutive winning seasons in a row. Again, this is something that the media today has no inkling of. Well, there's old Judge Landis, and I'm going to part with him, and I'll be happy at this point to answer any questions, or if there's anything I might have missed, I'll be free and happy to address it. Mike.
Just a couple of things. One, I found something in the congressional record in the 1921, somewhere in my files at home. Landis was being investigated for staying on the federal bench and grabbing his salary on the federal bench while he was commissioner.
Yeah.
And it took a while for Major League Baseball to say, come on, what are you, a judge or a commissioner? And they and so that kind of ended. But my other question is, I remember and this was many, many years ago when I read Elliot Daisanoff's book. He made a big thing about the grand jury records being gone or being missed. He went looking through them in the old criminal courts building and they were missing. And I don't believe that they've ever been found.
Well, the transcript of the trial is at the Chicago History Museum in the library.
The trial,
Right, but not, and also the confessions of Psychotti and Jackson went missing when Jackson tried to sue Comiskey for back pay in 1924. They conveniently reappeared in the custody of Alfred Austrian, the attorney. So, yeah, there was some underhanded dealing there because they were about to rule in Jackson's favor and to award him unpaid back salary, but they decided not to once the confessions magically reappeared.
I mentioned the grand jury records because this is a sort of a thing. It's kind of like investigating the mob.
Yeah.
They don't write down, I want Joe Chili Chavaco to be whacked next Thursday. They don't write that down. The ball players didn't write the stuff down. The gamblers didn't write things down.
No.
That's why I think it would be a tremendous service to history if we could find those grand jury.
Did you look in the Library of Congress? You think it might be there?
I doubt if they'd be there.
Yeah, probably.
As an Illinois legal matter, the criminal courts should have had a process for keeping their.
Unless Mayor Brown has it in their archive, which you never know. Some of these fabled landmark cases transcripts are kept, but it's a grand jury hearing. That's.
Having been an archivist, working for a bunch of lawyers, I know that if lawyers had their way, they would, when they were done with documents, they would burn them.
That could well be.
Because somewhere, somehow, some way, somebody might interpret a document, not the way the lawyer wanted them to interpret them.
Well, the confessions were given without counsel. Neither Jackson nor Psychotti had lawyers present when they admitted to it. And the other little anecdote to that is the supposed kid who's standing outside the courthouse who says, "Say it ain't so, Joe." I think history has pretty much debunked that never happened. It was great. It's a great human interest story, and I think Azanoff and John Sayles included it in the movie, but there's no evidence that ever actually happened. Yes, sir.
Two-part question. How much did the aftermath of the 1906 World Series, which Landis swore he would get his revenge on Comiskey, even though the players were innocent, and that included George Buck Weaver, whose only crime was attending a meeting with gamblers and players and failing to be a stooge on those players? And the second part, how much of a factor did the 1918 World Series, which there was a writer from the Sporting News wrote that how the Cubs gave away that series. There were a couple Cubs pitchers in bed with the Kansas City mob, and I think it was a first baseman, only one to be picked off first base twice for the Cubs. Black.
Well, I can't speak to the 1918 incident, but as early as 1903, there was a lot of money being bet on the very first Cubs-Sox postseason City Series. They used to run the City Series every year up until 1941, where the Cubs and Sox would play each other annually. And there was a Cub pitcher named Jack Taylor who was offered a sum of money to lose games to the White Sox, and that later came out. But what was your first question about Van Johnson in 1906?
I mean, well, about Landis. Landis swore he would get his revenge with Comiskey, but the only thing that George Buck Weaver was guilty of, and he batted 324 in that 1906 series, was that he...
No, you mean 1919.
Yeah, I mean 1919.
Right.
1919, he batted in the 1919. Why did I say 1906? Well, they won that one. But pretty much the only thing he was guilty of, he went to a meeting with gamblers and teammates, and he to be a stoolie on his teammates, and if you were a stoolie,
Yeah.
one, he was an honorable person.
Well,
Two,
it's-
if you were a stoolie, look what happened with Hell Chase, the guy that stooled on him, he was blackballed.
Well, it's a matter of honor, and it's a matter of conscience, and I do believe that Weaver deserves to, and it's doubtful that he ever sat in on a meeting. He heard the locker room talk, and he knew about it, but he kept it to
Never
him.
had meeting.
From what I've been able to determine, he never sat in a meeting where they conspired. That he just knew about it through talking to his friends, telling him it was going to happen. And yes, he batted .324. He was one of the top hitters in the series. Yes.
How about Fred McMullen? Fred McMullen just heard that it was going down, so he wanted in on it.
Yeah, Fred McMullen, who was a utility infielder, who I think only had 2 appearances in the World Series, he blackmailed the players into letting him in on the plot. He said he was going to go tell Comiskey if they didn't cut him in on the money. So, yeah, that's...
He didn't get all the money.
No, Jackson got money, Psychotti got money,
He offered to give it back to Comiskey, right?
right. But the part of it that really intrigues me that historians don't talk about is this whole 1920 season when they were throwing games and allowing Cleveland to win the pennant. Harvey McClellan, who later died of a stomach ailment when he was a young man, and a utility catcher named Bird Lynn went to Comiskey at the end of the 1920 season to say that they knew as a fact that Jackson and his teammates were throwing games in September of 1920. So what's apparent is that the gangsters were putting a lot of pressure on them, I think threatening them with exposure, that if they didn't lose games in 1920, they were going to certainly be in trouble. If they want to keep the lid on the thing, you better keep playing along. So that doesn't fit into the narrative of Elliot Azanoff or John Sayles or any of the others, who express such deep sympathy for these players. And there's been so many attempts to exonerate Joe Jackson, and
They weren't throwing games, the White Sox players in 1920.
they were clearly at the end of the season because the gambling odds were on Cleveland, not on the White Sox, and it originated out of the East Coast. And but that's the untold story, and you don't find that except there in Harold Seymour's book, Baseball: The Golden Age, which is an excellent volume. If you really want to read a clear, concise history of the Black Sox scandal, I would look at that book. David Petrusia's book on Arnold Rothstein is very good as well, and it talks about how Rothstein manipulated this group of gamblers in St. Louis. He had Ottell and Burns, but he was the puppet master. There was a gambler named Carl Zork in St. Louis. Then he had Ottell dealing with him and Ottell dealing with Burns. So there were different groups of gamblers. So the whole thing couldn't trace back to Rothstein. He had different operatives working at cross purposes.
Wasn't he responsible for Capone in Chicago?
Rothstein?
Well, I mean, he got his tutelage under Rothstein.
I think that's doubtful. Capone was just a thug when he came to Chicago in 1919. Rothstein was already an established, powerful gambling
And in
boss.
New York, didn't he get his tutelage under?
I don't think, no. Ethnically, no. Rothstein was Jewish, Capone was Italian, and he came from the 5 Points gang, and that really had nothing to do. New York gangs were very territorial and divided by ethnicity during those years. Yes,
I think we have time for maybe one more
okay.
question. Anybody have anything, comments, questions?
Yes, sir.
Why is it okay for Chuck Comiskey to be in the Hall of Fame?
Charles Comiskey, you mean.
Charles Comiskey. And,
Why?
no, wait a minute.
Okay.
And Buck Weaver did the exact same thing as Charles Comiskey. And he was banned for life, and he just was prison, that's all. And you said that Charles Comiskey also.
Well, Comiskey was in a precarious position financially. He suspended the players. He did that on his own volition before Landis told him to do it. And then he made them free agents in 1921. He made them free agents, which, like today, they would conceivably they could have signed with anybody else. And after he made them free agents, that's when Landis clamped down the ban that no team in organized baseball you will be blackballed and blacklisted if you take any of these guys on. And so variously they played in outlaw leagues over the next 10 or 12 years. Now the fairness of it, I don't think Weaver, if you look at his career statistics, he's marginal. And but you can say the same about Schalk too. His numbers were marginal even though he played 16 years. They were competent, steady players. Weaver was never a great hitter. He was like a 250, 260 hitter, but he was a great fielder. He taught himself how to field, especially when they moved him from shortstop to third base. I doubt it even if he was not involved in the Black Sox scandal. I seriously doubt he would have been in the Hall of Fame. I do believe that of the... Well, he wouldn't be elected. I mean, he simply didn't have the numbers. Now, fairness, Charles Comiskey revolutionized the game as a player. He, more than anyone, was responsible for the founding of the American League. He led 2 tours, one around the world, the other one to England. And in many ways, he was a baseball pioneer. He built the third all-steel concrete stadium in America. It was more or less for long and meritorious service that he went in. But the attitude towards him in 1939, when the White Sox, when the Hall of Fame started, the public revered Comiskey. That's what people fail to understand. Elliot Azanoff single-handedly made him the villain of baseball. But they wanted to run Comiskey for all of them. They called him Commie. That was his nickname. And he was a beloved figure. And yes, he was penurious to a lot of players. When I looked at his salaries that he paid, he was more than generous to bench players and utility players. He believed that the superstars of the game would always make the money that they were entitled to, not only in direct salary, but endorsements, appearing in vaudeville. Baseball players used to be on the vaudeville stage, too, during the off-season. That was one, and the more famous they were, the more popular they were. He believed that they would get their money, but he always tried to take care of the 250 infielder, the bench guy. Yeah, he was penurious, but so was Clark Griffith, so was Connie Mack, so was these were 19th century men who believed in the old bootstrap theory of pulling yourself up. I'm not condoning it. I'm just saying that when you look at history, you have to look at it subjectively. People's attitudes on certain things reflect a 21st century bias to different prevailing attitudes of yesteryear. And I think as a society, we get hung up on this issue, and we tend to weaponize history to reflect a certain point of view politically that we're living in today. I don't want to get into that tangent on politics, but I think in fairness, you have to evaluate a person within the context of the times that they live, not in the changing arena of public opinion as it evolves as time goes on. Okay?
And I think on that note, Mr. Lindberg, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for